I never thought I'd be writing something like this. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in airing personal stuff, but sometimes life doesn't just hit you. It blindsides you, knocks you on your ass, and makes you question every damn thing you thought you knew. My wife, Melissa, and I have been married for 8 years. We live in Chicago, in a modest 2-bedroom condo in Lakeview. It's nothing fancy, but it's home. The kind of place where the radiators clang in winter, the L trains rumble just close enough to lull you to sleep, and the corner diner serves up the best greasy breakfast for a hangover. Melissa loves Chicago. She's always had this city girl vibe, bright, ambitious, and just a little too polished to be your typical Midwest transplant. She works in marketing, handling big clients downtown, while I'm a freelance graphic designer, mostly working from home. Our life wasn't perfect, but it worked. We had our little routines: Thursday night deep dish pizza at Lou Malnati's, long walks by the lake when the weather wasn't miserable, and the occasional weekend escape to Door County when city life felt too much. Sure, there were rough patches. We'd fought about money, her long hours, and my career not taking off the way I hoped. But we always found our way back to each other. At least, that's what I thought. Then Melissa decided she wanted therapy. She'd been stressed for months, complaining about burnout, and saying she didn't feel like herself anymore. At first, I thought it was her job. Her boss could be a real piece of work, but then it became clear it was deeper than that. She talked about feeling lost, like she wasn't sure what she wanted out of life. It scared me. Melissa was always so put together, the one who had her 5-year plans and color-coded calendars. Seeing her unravel like that made me feel helpless. I encouraged her to go. Hell, I thought it was a good thing. If therapy could help her sort out whatever she was going through, I was all for it. But I didn't expect it to change her like it did. It started small. She found a therapist named Dr. Alan Burke, someone she'd found online with great reviews. She said he specialized in high-functioning professionals dealing with stress and identity crises. Exactly what I need, she told me. Her first session was on a Thursday evening. I remember because she texted me that night saying she'd be late and not to wait up for dinner. I didn't think much of it at the time. Traffic in Chicago is always a nightmare, and maybe the session ran long. But when she came home, she was different. Calmer, maybe? She said the session had been really eye-opening, and that Dr. Burke was great at making her feel comfortable. I was relieved, thinking maybe this was the first step toward her finding peace. But then the changes started piling up. She began dressing differently. Nothing drastic at first, just small things, swapping her usual cozy sweaters for more fitted blouses, wearing perfume I hadn't smelled on her in years. She became meticulous about her appearance, spending extra time on her hair and makeup before her therapy appointments. It struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was part of her feeling better about herself. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Her schedule became unpredictable. She used to be an open book, texting me during her lunch breaks, sharing her plans for the day. But now she was vague. If I asked when she'd be home, she'd reply with things like, "Not sure, depends on traffic," or, "I've got some errands to run after therapy." Once, when I pressed her about it, she snapped at me saying, "Can't I just have some space without you interrogating me?" That's dumb. Melissa was never one to snap like that, especially over something so trivial. Then there was her phone. Melissa used to leave it lying around, unlocked, like it was no big deal. But now it was always with her, face down on the table or tucked into her bag. She'd grown protective of it, even taking it into the bathroom with her. One night, while we were watching a movie, I caught her texting someone, smiling faintly at her screen. When I asked who it was, she shrugged and said, "Just work stuff." But the way she said it, too quick, too casual, didn't sit right with me. I'd be lying if I said I didn't start feeling paranoid. My mind went places I didn't want it to go. Was she pulling away from me? Was it the therapy making her see things differently? I told myself not to overthink it, that it was just a rough patch, and we'd get through it like we always did. But deep down, something felt off. It wasn't until a rainy Friday in October that things took a real turn. Melissa was at another therapy session, and I was home alone, trying to distract myself with work. Around 8 p.m., her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She'd left it behind, a rare slip-up. The screen lit up with a notification, a text from someone named Alan. I stared at it for a long moment. Alan. Her therapist's name. The message read, "Looking forward to seeing you again soon. Tonight was amazing." For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at her phone. The words burned into my brain, "Looking forward to seeing you again soon. Tonight was amazing." My pulse thudded in my ears. I felt like I just stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see, like opening a door to a room I didn't even know existed. I hesitated, caught in this tug-of-war between my better judgment and raw curiosity. I'd always believed in respecting Melissa's privacy, but this was different. My gut told me that whatever was going on with her, this text was a piece of the puzzle. My hands were trembling as I unlocked her phone. She never changed her passcode, an oversight, or maybe she didn't think she needed to. The message thread with Alan wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. Alan. Looking forward to seeing you again soon. Tonight was amazing. Melissa. You're incredible. I'm so grateful for you. Alan. You're the one who makes it special. Can't wait for our next session. I scrolled up, my heart pounding, but there wasn't much else. A few earlier messages about scheduling appointments, nothing overtly incriminating, but these last few texts? They weren't professional. Not even close. My first instinct was denial. I told myself I was jumping to conclusions, that I didn't have the full context. But the words lingered, heavy and undeniable. You're incredible. I'm so grateful for you. What kind of therapist texts his clients like that? I heard the keys jingle in the lock. Melissa was home. I quickly locked her phone and slid it back onto the counter, forcing myself to act normal. She walked in, shaking the rain off her umbrella and smiling when she saw me. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was insane." She looked glowing. Her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes had that bright, slightly dazed look. It was the kind of expression I hadn't seen in years, at least not directed at me. "No problem," I said, keeping my voice steady. "How was therapy?" "It was good. Productive." She walked over and kissed me on the cheek, a little too quick, like she was trying to distract me. "I think I'm starting to make real progress." I wanted to scream. Real progress? What the hell is that supposed to mean? But instead, I just nodded and let it go. That night, I couldn't sleep. She was lying next to me, scrolling on her phone, probably texting him again, and all I could think about was the man on the other end of those messages. Alan. Her therapist. The person who was supposed to be helping her, not whatever this was. The next day, I did something I'd never done before. I snooped. While Melissa was in the shower, I searched her bag. I found receipts from cafes and a florist, which seemed odd since she wasn't the flower-buying type. One receipt was for a fancy restaurant in River North, dated 2 weeks ago, the same night she told me she had a late session. I needed answers, but I couldn't just confront her, not yet. I needed more. The following week, Melissa's behavior became even more erratic. She started working late more often, and her therapy sessions seemed to stretch longer and longer. One evening, she didn't get home until almost midnight. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She hesitated, brushing rain off her coat. "Therapy ran late, and then I stopped for coffee to clear my head. You know how I get after those sessions." Her excuse felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced it on the way home. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to follow her. The next Thursday, Melissa left for her appointment like clockwork. I waited 10 minutes, then grabbed my coat and headed out. I knew where Dr. Burke's office was. She'd mentioned it was in Lincoln Park, a brownstone converted into a practice. It wasn't hard to find. Parking a few blocks away, I watched as Melissa's car pulled up outside the building. She got out, wearing that same fitted blouse she'd been favoring lately, and went inside. I waited. 40 minutes later, the door opened, and there she was, walking out with him. Alan Burke. He was taller than I expected, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of tailored suit that screamed money. They stood close, too close, talking and laughing like old friends. Then he reached out and touched her arm. It wasn't just a casual touch. It lingered. My blood ran cold as I watched them walk to his car together. They got in, and he drove off, with Melissa in the passenger seat. I followed them. They didn't go far, just a few blocks to a trendy little bistro I recognized. It was the kind of place we used to go on anniversaries, the kind of place where couples sit across from each other holding hands over candlelight. And that's exactly what they were doing. I parked across the street and watched through the window as they sat together, laughing, leaning in close. She looked happy. Radiant. Like she hadn't a care in the world. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. When they finally left, they walked back to his car. He opened the door for her, like some kind of gentleman, and she smiled up at him in a way I hadn't seen in years. Then he kissed her. Not just a peck. A real kiss. My chest tightened, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. I wanted to storm out of the car, to march up to them and demand answers. But I couldn't move. I drove home in a daze, replaying the scene over and over in my head. By the time Melissa came back that night, I was sitting in the dark, waiting for her. She walked in, cheerful and oblivious. "Hey," she said, kicking off her shoes. "Sorry I'm late again. Therapy's just been a lot lately." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "Melissa," I said quietly, "is there something you want to tell me?" Doorway, her keys still in her hand. For a moment, her cheerful demeanor faltered, replaced by a flicker of something. Panic, maybe? It was subtle, but I caught it. "Tell you what?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger in check. "I feel like you've been different lately. Distant. Like you're hiding something from me." She frowned, setting her bag down slowly. "I'm not hiding anything, Derek. I've just been stressed, and therapy is helping me deal with it." "Why are you making it a thing?" Her deflection only made my blood boil. I wanted to scream at her, "Don't lie to me, I saw you." But instead, I forced myself to stay calm. "I saw a text from Ellen," I said, watching her closely. It didn't sound professional. Her eyes widened for a split second before she caught herself. She tried to play it off, crossing her arms defensively. "You went through my phone? Are you serious right now?" "I didn't go through it," I shot back. "It lit up while you were gone. His message popped up, and it didn't look like something a therapist would send to a client." Melissa's face hardened. "I can't believe this. I go to therapy to work on myself, and you're spying on me? This is exactly why I need therapy. Because you're so damn controlling." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Controlling? I wasn't the one sneaking around, having dinner dates with another man. But I couldn't let her turn this around on me. "Then explain it," I said, my voice shaking. "Explain why your therapist is texting you like that. Explain why I saw you having dinner with him tonight. Why he kissed you." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked stunned, like she hadn't expected me to catch her in the act. "Derek, she started, but then she stopped herself, pressing her lips together as if searching for the right words. "Just tell me the truth, Melissa," I pleaded. "I deserve that much." She took a shaky breath and sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling. "It's not what you think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, really?" I said, crossing my arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for months. Therapy? That's a joke. You've been using it as an excuse too. I couldn't even finish the sentence. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of guilt or defiance. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said softly. The room felt like it was spinning. I sat down heavily in the chair across from her, my hands gripping the armrests. How long? I asked. How long has this been going on? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. A couple of months, she admitted finally. It started. I don't know. It just happened. I didn't plan it. Her words hit me like a freight train. A couple of months. That meant every therapy session, every late night, every excuse. It had all been a lie. Why? I asked, my voice cracking. Why him? Why anyone? I thought we were happy. Melissa looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know, she said. I was feeling lost and he listened. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Her words cut deep. And I didn't? I asked bitterly. It's not that, she said quickly. It's not about you, Derek. It's about me. I've been struggling, and I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I laughed bitterly. A mistake? That's what you're calling it. I didn't mean for it to get physical, she said, her voice breaking. It started with conversations, honest conversations, and it just escalated. I wasn't thinking straight. I was vulnerable, and he took advantage of that. Something in her tone shifted, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of resentment toward Alan. But it didn't change what she'd done. What now? I asked quietly. Are you in love with him? Do you want to be with him? No, she said emphatically. I don't want to be with him. I never did. It was a stupid, selfish thing I did, and I hate myself for it. Her words sounded sincere, but I didn't know if I could believe her. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild with apologies alone. I need some time, I said finally, standing up. I can't do this right now. Derek, please, she started, but I held up my hand to stop her. Don't. I need space to think. I grabbed my jacket and left the apartment, the cold Chicago air hitting me like a slap to the face. I walked aimlessly, my mind racing with 1,000 questions I didn't have answers to. Was our marriage salvageable? Could I ever forgive her? Did I even want to? I didn't know how long I walked, but by the time I stopped, I found myself at Wrigley Field. The lights from the stadium reflected off the wet streets, casting everything in a soft, hazy glow. This was one of those places in Chicago that always felt alive, even on a quiet night like this. But tonight it felt different. Empty. I sat on a bench nearby, my thoughts swirling. I tried to make sense of it all, replaying every moment of the last few months in my head. Had I missed the signs? Could I have done something differently? The idea that Melissa had confided in Alan, someone who was supposed to be a professional, a neutral party, made me sick. The worst part was, I couldn't shake the image of them at that bistro. Her smile, the way she looked at him, the kiss. It was burned into my mind like a scar. I must have sat there for over an hour before my phone buzzed. A text from Melissa. I know you're angry, but please come home. We need to talk. I stared at the message, torn. Part of me wanted to go back, to demand more answers, to confront her until I understood how she could do this to me. But another part of me, the part that was exhausted, broken, didn't want to see her at all. In the end, I stayed out until I couldn't take the cold anymore. By the time I got home, it was after midnight. Melissa was sitting on the couch, her face pale and puffy from crying. She looked up when I walked in, but I didn't say anything. I just went straight to the bedroom and shut the door. The next morning, things were tense. Melissa tried to talk to me over breakfast, but I barely responded. I couldn't bring myself to look at her without feeling a wave of anger and betrayal. I know I messed up, she said quietly. But I want to fix this. I'll stop seeing him. I'll find another therapist. Whatever it takes. Her words felt hollow. She'd already crossed the line. What difference did it make now? I need time, Melissa, I said finally. I can't just pretend this didn't happen. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes, but she didn't push me. That day, I couldn't focus on work. Every email, every design project, felt pointless. My mind kept drifting back to Alan. I wanted to know who this guy really was, beyond the polished professional facade. What kind of therapist crosses a line like that? So, I started digging. It didn't take long to find Dr. Alan Burke's website. His bio was everything you'd expect: Ivy League education, years of experience, glowing testimonials from satisfied clients. He looked every bit the part: clean-cut, confident, trustworthy. It made me sick. But then I found something interesting. A Reddit thread about unethical therapists. Someone had mentioned a Dr. Alan Burke in Chicago, claiming he'd been inappropriate with female clients in the past. There were no details, just vague accusations, but it was enough to make my blood boil. I needed more. The next step was risky, but I didn't care. I called his office, pretending to be a potential new client. "Hi, this is Derek Mitchell," I said, trying to sound casual. "I was referred to Dr. Burke by a colleague and wanted to see if he's taking on new patients." The receptionist was polite but firm. "Dr. Burke is currently at capacity and not accepting new clients." "Of course," I said. "I just heard such great things about him. Does he specialize in anything in particular?" "Well, Dr. Burke works primarily with high-achieving professionals dealing with stress, burnout, and relationship issues," she explained. "He's known for building strong connections with his clients, which is why he's so sought after." Strong connections. That was one way to put it. I thanked her and hung up, feeling more frustrated than ever. I wanted to confront him, to see him face to face and make him explain himself. But what would that accomplish? He'd probably just deny everything. That night, Melissa tried again to talk to me. "I want to be honest with you," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "Now you want to be honest?" I shot back, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "I deserve that," she admitted. "But Derek, you need to understand, what happened with Alan wasn't about you. It wasn't because you weren't enough or because I don't love you." "Then why?" I demanded. "Why him?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "He made me feel understood. Like he saw the parts of me I didn't even know how to explain. I was vulnerable, and he took advantage of that. I didn't realize how wrong it was until it was too late." Her words stung. She sounded more like a victim than a partner who had betrayed me. It was hard to tell if she was genuinely remorseful or just trying to shift the blame. "I'm not sure I can believe you," I said finally. She reached across the table, her eyes pleading. "Derek, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I'll go to therapy alone. I'll go with you if you want. Just don't give up on us." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. "I need to think," I said, standing up. "That's all I can promise right now." For the next few days, I tried to keep my distance. Melissa gave me space, but I could tell she was struggling. She texted me throughout the day, small things, like asking how my work was going or if I wanted her to pick up dinner, but I barely responded. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop obsessing over Alan. He was the symbol of everything wrong in my life, and I couldn't let it go. Finally, I made a decision. If I was ever going to move forward, one way or another, I needed closure. I needed to confront him. I didn't tell Melissa what I was planning. She'd already tried to convince me she wanted to cut ties with Alan, but I couldn't trust her words. I needed to look him in the eye, to hear his side of the story. Maybe it was foolish, but I felt like I wouldn't be able to move on until I faced him. The next afternoon, I drove to his office in Lincoln Park. The brownstone looked quiet, almost too serene for what it represented to me. I parked across the street and waited. A little after 5 p.m., Alan stepped out. He was just as polished as the photos on his website: salt and pepper hair, tailored suit, confident stride. He didn't look like a man carrying the weight of an affair with a married client. He looked smug. I followed him from a distance, watching as he walked to a nearby cafe. It was a cozy spot, the kind of place that smelled like freshly brewed coffee and homemade pastries. He ordered a drink and settled into a corner table, pulling out his phone. This was my chance. I walked in, my hands balled into fists. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but my emotions were bubbling just below the surface. I approached his table, and he looked up, surprised. "Dr. Burke?" I asked, my voice tight. "Yes?" he said, his brow furrowing. "I'm Derek Mitchell," I said, sitting down across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Melissa's husband." His expression shifted, just slightly, but it was enough. He knew who I was, and he wasn't happy to see me. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell, but I can't discuss my clients," he said, his tone professional but icy. "Cut the crap," I snapped. "I know about the texts. I know about the dinners. I know you kissed her." Alan's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, defensiveness, maybe. "I think you're misunderstanding the situation," he said. "Am I?" I leaned forward, my voice low and angry. "Because it seems pretty damn clear to me. You took advantage of her. She came to you for help, and you crossed the line. You're a predator." Alan's jaw tightened. "I'm not going to dignify that accusation with a response," he said. "But I will say this: Melissa is an adult. She makes her own choices." The way he said it, so cold and detached, made my blood boil. "You're a piece of work, you know that?" I spat. "You call yourself a therapist? You're a fraud. You don't help people, you destroy them." He finally set his phone down, his eyes locking on mine. "I'm not going to argue with you, Mr. Mitchell. If you have an issue with your wife, take it up with her. My relationship with Melissa is over. It ended the moment she decided to come clean to you." I froze. "She told you she confessed?" "Yes," he said simply. "She said she wanted to focus on repairing her marriage." I respected that decision. The calmness in his voice only made me angrier. He was acting like this was some mutual breakup, like they were star-crossed lovers instead of two people engaged in a betrayal that had torn my life apart. I stood up, my hands trembling. "You'd better pray I never see you again," I said through gritted teeth. Alan didn't respond. He simply picked up his coffee and went back to his phone, as though I were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. When I got home, Melissa was waiting for me. She looked anxious, like she knew exactly where I'd been. "You went to see him, didn't you?" she asked. "Yeah, I did," I said, dropping my coat on the chair. "And I'm glad I did. Do you know what he said? He acted like this was some kind of romance, like you two were on equal footing. He doesn't feel the slightest bit guilty for what he did." Melissa's face crumpled. "I'm so sorry, Derek," she whispered. "Sorry doesn't fix this," I snapped. "Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed my trust in you. In us. How am I supposed to come back from that?" She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I know I've hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "But I don't want to lose you. I love you, Derek. I made a terrible mistake, but I want to make things right. Please tell me what I can do." I stared at her, my heart torn between anger and the faintest flicker of hope. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could rebuild what we had. But the weight of her betrayal felt suffocating. "I don't know," I said finally. "I don't know if we can fix this." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, as if she understood that this wasn't something we could solve overnight. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said quietly. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on myself. I stayed out of the apartment as much as possible, spending hours walking along the lakefront or sitting in coffee shops. I needed space to process everything, to figure out if I could forgive Melissa, or if I even wanted to. One night, as I sat by the water, staring out at the city skyline, I thought about all the good times we'd shared. The late-night drives, the lazy Sundays, the way she used to laugh at my terrible jokes. I wondered if those memories were enough to outweigh the pain of what she'd done. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of clarity. This wasn't just about Melissa's choices. It was about mine. I stayed by the lake until the cold wind forced me to head home. The truth was, I didn't want to go back to the apartment. Being around Melissa was like walking through a minefield. Every word, every glance felt loaded with meaning. She was trying, I could see that, but I didn't know if it was enough. When I walked through the door, Melissa was sitting at the dining table, her laptop open, papers scattered around her. She looked up as I came in, her face hopeful and hesitant. "Hey," she said softly. I nodded, not saying anything as I shrugged off my coat and hung it up. "I've been doing some research," she said, gesturing to the mess of papers in front of her. "On couples therapy. There's a place in River North that specializes in rebuilding trust after infidelity." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I walked over and glanced at the papers. They were printed pages from websites, testimonials from couples who had apparently survived what we were going through. "It's a start," I said, my tone neutral. Her face lit up just a little, as though she'd been bracing for me to dismiss the idea entirely. "Would you be willing to try it?" she asked. I hesitated. The thought of sitting in a room with Melissa and some stranger, rehashing everything she'd done, wasn't exactly appealing. But what was the alternative? Divorce? Starting over completely? "I'll think about it," I said finally. She nodded, accepting my answer without pushing further. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. The next few days passed in a tense limbo. Melissa gave me space, but I could tell she was struggling to hold herself together. She kept herself busy cleaning, cooking, doing anything to make herself useful. It was almost painful to watch. One night I caught her staring at her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger. She looked up and saw me watching, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so scared, Derek," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared I've ruined everything." I didn't know what to say to that. Maybe because part of me felt the same way. Eventually, I agreed to try couples therapy. I figured it couldn't hurt, and if nothing else, it might help me sort through my own feelings. The first session was awkward as hell. The therapist, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Patel, asked us to introduce ourselves and explain why we were there. Melissa went first. She talked about feeling lost, about how she'd let herself become vulnerable to someone who shouldn't have crossed professional boundaries. She admitted that she'd made terrible choices and that she was desperate to make things right. When it was my turn, I didn't hold back. I talked about the betrayal, the lies, the way it had shattered my trust. I told Dr. Patel that I didn't know if I could forgive Melissa, and that scared me. Dr. Patel listened without judgment, her calm presence making it easier to open up. By the end of the session, I felt like we'd taken a small step forward, even if the path ahead was still unclear. Outside the office, Melissa reached for my hand as we walked to the car. I hesitated for a moment, then let her take it. It felt strange, familiar and foreign at the same time. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving this a chance." I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. The sessions continued over the next few weeks. Each one was a roller coaster of emotions. Some days it felt like we were making progress, like we were starting to understand each other in ways we hadn't before. Other days it felt like we were ripping open old wounds without any clear path to healing. One night, after an especially difficult session, Melissa turned to me as we drove home. "I want to show you something," she said. "What is it?" I asked, glancing at her. "You'll see," she said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. She directed me to a storage unit on the outskirts of the city. As we walked inside, she led me to a small box labeled college stuff. Inside were old journals, letters, and photos, pieces of her past that she'd kept hidden away. "I want you to see this," she said, handing me one of the journals. "This is where I started to lose myself. Long before Alan." The journal was filled with entries about her struggles, her insecurities, her fears of failure, her constant need to prove herself. It was raw and vulnerable in a way I'd never seen from her before. "I've always been afraid of being honest," she admitted. "Even with you." I thought I had to be perfect all the time, and when I couldn't keep it up, I fell apart. Her words hit me hard. I realized that while I'd been so focused on her betrayal, I hadn't really tried to understand what had led her to that point. It wasn't an excuse. Nothing could excuse what she'd done. But for the first time, I started to see her not just as the woman who had hurt me, but as someone who was hurting herself. That night, as we drove home, I found myself thinking about the vows we'd made 8 years ago. For better or worse. In sickness and in health. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her completely. But I knew I wasn't ready to give up. The weeks after Melissa's confession and our first steps in therapy were some of the most emotionally exhausting of my life. The anger didn't go away overnight, and some days it flared up without warning. A memory would surface, like the night she came home glowing after one of her sessions with Alan, and I'd feel that familiar knot of betrayal twist in my stomach. But there were also moments, small and fleeting, where I felt a flicker of hope. Like when she laughed at one of my dumb jokes, or when she leaned her head on my shoulder during a movie. Those moments reminded me of the woman I fell in love with, the woman I still wanted to believe was in there somewhere. In therapy, Dr. Patel encouraged us to be honest, even when it was uncomfortable. One session, she asked Melissa to describe how the affair began. "It wasn't planned," Melissa said, her voice shaky. "I wasn't looking for anything like that. But Alan, he had a way of making me feel seen, like he understood everything I was going through. At first, it was just emotional. I'd talk about things I couldn't even say out loud to myself, and he'd listen without judgment." "And when did it become physical?" Dr. Patel asked gently. Melissa hesitated, glancing at me before looking down at her hands. "It was after a particularly tough session. I was crying, and he comforted me. One thing led to another, and it just happened." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I gripped the armrest of the chair, my knuckles turning white. "I didn't go there intending for it to happen," Melissa continued. "But once it did, I couldn't stop. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that I'd end it before it got too far. But it was already too far." Her voice broke, and tears streamed down her face. "I hate myself for what I did. I hate that I hurt you, Derek. You didn't deserve any of this." I sat there in silence, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand why she hadn't stopped herself before crossing that line. But another part of me, the part that had agreed to therapy, knew that yelling wouldn't fix anything. Dr. Patel turned to me. "How does hearing this make you feel, Derek?" "Angry," I said honestly. "But also, I don't know. Relieved, maybe? At least now I know the truth." "Truth is the foundation of healing," Dr. Patel said. "If you choose to move forward, it has to be built on honesty from both of you." After that session, Melissa and I walked back to the car in silence. When we got in, she turned to me. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked, confused. "For not giving up on me," she said, her voice breaking again. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure if I hadn't given up or if I was just too stubborn to walk away. The turning point came one night when Melissa and I were sitting on the couch, flipping through old photo albums. She'd suggested it as a way to reconnect, to remind ourselves of the good times we'd shared before everything fell apart. We came across a photo from our honeymoon in Maui. In the picture, we were standing on a beach at sunset, my arm around her waist, both of us grinning like idiots. "I miss those days," Melissa said softly. "Me too," I admitted. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "I want to get back to that, Derek. I know it won't be easy, and I know it might never be the same. But I want to try. Do you?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I thought about everything we'd been through, the betrayal, the lies, the anger. But I also thought about the life we'd built together, the moments of joy and laughter that still lingered in my memory. "I want to try," I said finally. "But I need you to understand that it's going to take time. And I need to see that you're committed to making this work." "I am," she said without hesitation. Over the next few months, we worked on rebuilding our relationship piece by piece. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments when the trust we were trying to rebuild felt impossibly fragile. But there were also moments of connection, like when we took a spontaneous road trip to Wisconsin or stayed up late talking about our dreams for the future. Melissa found a new therapist, one who came highly recommended and was adamant about maintaining professional boundaries. She also took ownership of her actions, making a point to show me that she was committed to earning back my trust. For my part, I tried to let go of the anger, though it wasn't always easy. Some days, the memories of what she'd done still crept in, threatening to pull me back into that dark place. But I reminded myself that healing was a process, not a destination. One night, as we sat on the balcony of our condo, looking out over the Chicago skyline, Melissa reached for my hand. "I know I can't undo the past," she said, "but I want you to know that I'm grateful for you, for giving me a second chance." I squeezed her hand, the weight of her words sinking in. "We're not there yet," I said honestly, "but we're getting closer." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll keep fighting for us, Derek. For as long as it takes." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her.